I wandered around the house slowly, hugging myself as I took one last look at the place that had somehow transformed into a haven of warmth and memories. Each corner seemed to hold a story. The way the sunlight filtered through the windows in the mornings, the cozy evenings by the fire, and the quiet moments where everything felt perfect. A small smile curved on my lips as I thought about how much I had enjoyed every moment in this place. As I lingered by the door, Grayson came into view carrying the last of our bags. His stride was confident as always, but there was something softer in his expression when he spotted me standing there. "You're not in the car," he remarked, stopping to set the bags down near the trunk. I turned to him, still smiling. "I was just enjoying the view one last time." He studied me for a moment before a tender smile graced his face. He moved to the trunk, carefully placing the bags inside before closing it with a quiet thud. Then, without a word, he walked toward me, slipping his arms around my waist and pulling me close. Grayson leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to my lips. It was unhurried, filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart flutter. When he pulled back, his voice was low and gentle. "We can always come back here if you want to." I wrapped my arms around his neck, holding him close as I rested my forehead against his. "I can't ask for more," I murmured, my voice thick with emotion. "This has been the most beautiful moment of my life, and I'd love to spend more and more of it with you." His hands tightened slightly on my waist, his gaze locking with mine. "Same here," he said, his voice full of conviction before he leaned down and captured my lips again. The kiss deepened, pulling us into a world of our own where nothing else mattered. His hands moved to cradle my face, his touch both firm and tender as the world around us faded away. The warmth of his lips and the steady beat of his heart against mine made me feel grounded, as though I belonged nowhere else but here, in his arms. And then, the sharp, insistent ring of his phone broke through the moment. Grayson ignored it, his grip on me tightening as if to block out the distraction. He kissed me again, his lips moving against mine with a renewed fervour, as if to reclaim the moment the phone had stolen. But when it rang a second time, the sound was harder to ignore, and I found myself pulling back slightly, my hands resting on his chest. "Grayson," I said softly, my voice carrying a hint of amusement. "You should answer that. It might be urgent." His brows knit together in frustration, and he let out a quiet groan of protest. "Whatever it is, it can wait," he muttered, leaning in as though to kiss me again. I placed a gentle hand on his chest, holding him back just enough to meet his gaze. "It might not be able to," I reasoned, my tone playful but firm. He sighed, reaching into his pocket with obvious reluctance to retrieve his phone. As he glanced at the screen, his expression darkened slightly, his jaw tightening. "Who is it?" I asked, curiosity tugging at me. His gaze flicked back to mine, and I saw the shift in his demeanour, the calmness giving way to something more serious. "It's business," he said simply, his tone clipped. I nodded, stepping back to give him space. "Take it," I urged. My smile meant to reassure him, even as a small pang of disappointment settled in my chest. The moment we'd shared was fleeting, but it was ours, and I knew I'd carry it with me no matter what came next. Grayson hesitated for a second longer before answering the call, his voice low as he stepped away. I watched him, my arms wrapping around myself again, the warmth of our shared kiss still lingering on my lips. He stepped away to take his call, his phone pressed to his ear as he walked toward the far end of the parking lot. I sighed, sinking into the passenger seat, the silence around me feeling oddly heavy. He'd been warm, almost gentle earlier, but now there was something distant in the way he'd moved. It didn't take much to figure out the call had rattled him. I dug my phone out of my bag, feeling the familiar weight of dread settle in my chest. I knew what I was about to see even before I turned it on. And sure enough, the moment the screen came to life, a barrage of notifications filled it. Missed calls, texts, voicemails. Ethan, of course. With a sigh, I tapped his name and lifted the phone to my ear. He answered on the first ring. Finally! His voice was a mix of relief and annoyance. Why did you turn off your phone? Are you all right? I'm fine, I replied, keeping my voice calm. I didn't need him worrying more than he already was. You can breathe now. Ethan let out a long, exaggerated sigh, the kind that told me just how much he'd been holding in. That sounds good. How are you and Matthew? Other than worrying about you. His tone softened slightly. We're okay. Good, I said with a small smile. We're on our way home. There was a pause on his end, followed by a low chuckle. Which home are you talking about? This mansion? Is this mansion what you're calling home? I rolled my eyes and sighed. Ethan, please, don't start. I'm just saying, let's talk when I get there. I cut him off. Out of the corner of my eye, I spotted Grayson walking back toward the car. I'll see you soon, okay? Fine, Ethan muttered, though I could tell he wasn't thrilled. Be safe. I ended the call just as Grayson climbed into the driver's seat. His face was stiff, his jaw clenched tight, and the easy warmth I'd seen earlier had vanished completely. The tension radiating from him was palpable. What's wrong? I asked carefully, not sure if he'd even answer. Work problem, he said curtly, his tone flat, his eyes fixed on the road as he started the car. I frowned, watching him for a moment. The distance in his voice, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel just a little too tightly. It was clear there was more to it. But I bit my tongue, deciding it wasn't the time to push. Instead, I turned my gaze out the window. Whatever that call was about, it had clearly soured his mood. As the car rolled to a stop, the mansion's gates opened with their usual slow, heavy grind. I glanced at Grayson, hoping he'd shake off the tense expression he'd worn since his call. Instead, he stopped the car just past the gate and shifted into the park. Go ahead inside, he said, his tone calm but distant. I turned to him, frowning. You're not coming along? He shook his head, his grip on the wheel tightening for a moment before he let out a slow breath. I've got some work to take care of. I studied his face, my chest tightening with unease. Something about his expression, so controlled yet so cold, made my stomach churn. That look scares me, Grayson, I admitted softly. It worries me a lot. His features softened just enough to remind me of the man I'd seen earlier, the one who could make me feel safe in his own complicated way. He reached for my hands, wrapping his larger ones around mine. Don't worry, my love, he said, his voice quieter now, more intimate. This isn't about us. It's just work, something I need to finish. He held my gaze firmly, his warmth momentarily breaking through. Go inside. I'm sure your brothers are waiting for you. I nodded, though my worry didn't lessen. The reassurance felt more like a temporary balm than a solution. Still, I managed a small, shaky smile and leaned forward, pressing a light kiss to his cheek. Be careful, I whispered before pulling back. As I opened the door, he called after me. Ariana, about your mother, I'll need some details, names, anything you can get. Ask your brother and send them to me. I turned back to him and nodded. I'll do that. His eyes lingered on me for a moment, something unreadable in their depths. Before he shifted the car into gear and drove off, the sound of the engine fading as he disappeared around the corner. I stood there for a moment, watching until he was completely out of sight, the uneasy knot in my stomach growing tighter. Shaking off my unease for now, I turned toward the mansion, making my way up the stairs. The house was eerily quiet, and an unsettling silence filled the air. I couldn't find Ethan or Matthew anywhere downstairs, so I headed to their room. I knocked gently on the door, but there was no answer. Frowning, I slowly pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty. My heart skipped a beat. Where could they be right now? I turned to leave, hoping to find them elsewhere in the house, but I nearly collided with Ethan just outside the door. Holy God! Where did you come from? I gasped, startled. Ethan's expression was tense, his brow furrowed with concern. I've been looking for Matthew, he said, voice strained. I haven't seen him in over 4 hours. I raised an eyebrow, trying to mask my worry. I'm sure he's around here somewhere. Maybe he got caught up with one of the maids. Like mingling. You know how he is. Too private when it comes to his personal life. Ethan sighed, the weight of his worry still visible in his eyes. Yeah, but something's not right. I haven't found him anywhere and he's been acting off lately. Before I could ask how, Florence suddenly appeared in the doorway. She didn't even glance at me as she addressed Ethan, her tone sharp. I need to speak with you, she said, her voice flat, her eyes fixed on him, ignoring my presence completely. Ethan turned to me, and without missing a beat, he spoke to me with authority. Ariana, leave us alone for a moment. I opened my mouth to protest, but he cut me off with a raised tone, one that was more commanding than I'd ever heard from him before. It won't take long, Ariana, he said, his voice firm and urgent. I froze, startled by the sharpness in his voice. It was like a snap that reverberated through me, making my throat tighten. For a moment I simply stared at him, processing what had just happened. I stormed out of the room, the sharp sound of the door closing behind me echoing through the hall. My mind raced as I leaned against the door, pressing my ear to the wooden surface. Whatever Ethan and Florence were discussing, it was intense enough for him to shut me out. My curiosity burned like a flame. Their voices were muffled, but I could catch faint snippets of words, nothing clear enough to make sense of, just tones of urgency and frustration. I pressed closer, determined to hear more, when suddenly the door flew open. I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing as Ethan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing smirk tugging at his lips. I knew you'd be eavesdropping, Ariana, he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and amusement. Do me a favor and head downstairs. I crossed my arms over my chest, glaring at him. What business do you have with that woman, Ethan? You barely know her, yet suddenly you're having private conversations. His expression darkened, but he kept his tone measured. Ariana, go. I'll explain everything later. I exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling in my chest. You'd better, I muttered, turning on my heel and walking down the hall. But I didn't head downstairs. Instead, I stopped at the railing overlooking the entrance hall foyer, leaning against it as my gaze flicked back and forth. My hands gripped the iron tightly, my fury boiling beneath the surface. What were they talking about that needed to be hidden from me? As I fumed, movement downstairs caught my eye. I looked down and felt my stomach tighten. Skyla. I turned away, intending to ignore her, but something in her hand snagged my attention. She was holding a male t-shirt, Matthew's shirt. A sinking feeling settled in my gut as questions flooded my mind. What was she doing with my brother's shirt? Without thinking, I barreled down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the quiet house. Skyla, I called, my voice sharp as a knife. She didn't stop or even glance back. Instead, she descended into the basement, disappearing into the shadows. Fueled by a mix of dread and anger, I followed her, my steps quick and deliberate. The basement was cold and dimly lit, the air thick with a damp chill that made my skin crawl. My heart pounded as I caught sight of her entering a room at the far end of the hall. I hesitated for only a second before stepping inside. My breath caught in my throat. Matthew was there, tied to a bed, his body limp, his chest barely rising and falling. He looked unconscious, his face pale, as if he'd been drained of every ounce of energy. Matthew, I screamed, rushing toward him, but before I could reach his side, a sharp yank on my hair stopped me in my tracks. Pain shot through my scalp as Skyla pulled me back, her grip like iron. Not so fast, she hissed, her voice dripping with malice. I struggled against her hold, my eyes darting back to Matthew. "What have you done to him? Let me go!" Skyla's laughter was cold, sending chills down my spine. "He's where he needs to be, and so are you." Fear and rage intertwined, and I clawed at her hand, desperate to break free. "You won't get away with this, Skyla. I swear." But before I could finish, she threw me to the floor, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. I gasped, my vision swimming as I scrambled to my feet, ready to fight. I stared at her, disbelief making my blood boil. "What is your problem, Skyla?" I demanded, my voice sharp and biting. "What do you even want?" "I want Grayson back," she said, her voice calm, like she hadn't just announced the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. I blinked, the audacity of her words making my jaw drop slightly. Then, without meaning to, a sharp laugh broke free. It wasn't humour, it was the kind of laugh that comes when someone says something so ridiculous, you can't help yourself. "Are you even hearing yourself right now?" I asked, my voice dripping with disbelief as I looked her up and down. "You want who back? Grayson?" Skyla's smug expression faltered for just a second, but she recovered quickly. "So, let me get this straight," I said, stepping closer to her, each word sharp as a dagger. "You want him back now, after everything you've done, after you hurt him, after you cheated on him, with his brother?" I watched her face carefully, hoping to see some flicker of shame. Instead, her jaw tightened and her eyes burned with anger. "You don't know anything about what we had," she snapped, her voice rising with defensive venom. I folded my arms, levelling her with a stare that could cut through steel. "What you had is long gone, Skyla. You killed it the moment you betrayed him. You don't get to waltz back into his life like nothing happened. Do you even hear how insane you sound right now?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, her nostrils flaring. "You don't understand," she hissed. "He's mine. He's always been mine." Something inside me snapped at that. I took another step closer, my voice steady and cold. "Grayson doesn't belong to you, or anyone else. And let's get one thing straight. He's not yours anymore, and he never will be. He's mine." Her hands balled into fists at her sides, but I didn't back down. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, but I held my ground. "Do you even love him?" I hissed, my voice low and cutting. "Or is it that you just can't stand to see him happy without you?" Skyla opened her mouth but said nothing, her silence speaking volumes. The hesitation in her eyes was all I needed to confirm what I already suspected. "Answer me, bitch," I snapped, stepping closer to her. She instinctively took a step back, her smug confidence faltering. My voice rose, fueled by the anger burning in my chest. "I want to know why you ran away from him in the first place. I want to know why you left him for me to pick up the pieces, and go through hell because of you." I took another step, her retreat more noticeable now, and I didn't stop. And now, when things have finally settled, when we've finally found some peace, finally seen a side of each other that's warm, that's real, you think you can just come back and claim him? Like on what grounds, woman? Tell me. Her silence screamed louder than any words, and I could feel my blood pounding in my ears as I turned away from her. "Get out of my way," I said through gritted teeth, shoving her aside as I knelt by my brother. "I need to get him out of here." I bent down, my fingers working quickly to untie the ropes binding him. My hands trembled from the adrenaline rushing through me, but I kept going. I had to get him out of this nightmare before she tried anything else. But then, sharp pain. It was sudden, a prick at my neck so quick and so precise that it didn't register immediately. My hand flew up, brushing the small object lodged there, but it was too late. My vision blurred and a wave of dizziness knocked me sideways. "No," I whispered, my voice slurring as I felt my body tipping over, landing against my brother's still form. I slowly opened my eyes, groaning in discomfort. My groans were muffled, the sound barely escaping through the tape on my mouth. It felt like my head was filled with fog. Everything slow and distant, like I was waking from a nightmare that I couldn't quite remember. When my vision finally cleared, my heart dropped into my stomach. I was tied to a bed, my body feeling heavy and weak. The room was cold, too cold. My eyes locked onto Matthew, lying on the bed next to me, his body limp and eerily still. His skin had a sickly pale hue, almost ghostly in the low light, and I could feel a pit of dread forming in my stomach. The cold was making him worse. I needed to do something, anything, but the situation was already slipping out of control. I pulled against the restraints, the metal cuffs digging into my skin, cold and unforgiving. The struggle only made it worse. The more I tried to twist my wrists free, the more I realized these weren't ordinary ropes. They were handcuffs, secure, tight, not something I could break out of with brute force. Panic started to claw at my chest as I tried to think of another way, but my mind was clouded, my options growing slimmer by the second. I shifted my gaze back to Matthew, trying to shake off the mounting panic. "Matthew," I tried to call, but the tape muffled the words, swallowing them before they could even leave my mouth. His name hung there, unheard, as my lips barely moved beneath the sticky adhesive. My body trembled with frustration, but there was nothing I could do. But then, something else caught my attention, something so out of place that it made my heart stop. I looked down at myself, the realization hitting like a slap in the face. My clothes weren't mine anymore. The fabric was different, Skyla's clothes to be exact. My hand still cuffed behind me trembled, my mind spinning. Why had she changed me into her clothes? What was she planning?